Good afternoon, everyone. When we covered affordable dwelling unit ordinances in March, we heard from many of you that you wanted to learn more about the often misunderstood ADU cousin, accessory dwelling units. So welcome to our Lunch and Learn session on accessory dwelling units. I'm Hannah Matuda, Director of Policy and Programs at Navaja, and I'm joined by my colleagues Jill Norcross, Executive Director of Navaja, and Alice Hogan, Director of Navaja Arlington. Years ago, I actually lived in an accessory dwelling unit, all while juggling a retail job and finishing my college education. The affordable rent was really instrumental in allowing me to balance work, education, and personal finances effectively. It really played a crucial role in stabilizing my economic situation and has allowed me to thrive. And honestly, I owe much of where I am today to that opportunity. So today we'll delve into the broader impact of accessory dwelling units. These units serve various purposes, such as enabling aging in place, supporting multi-generational living arrangements, and providing essential diversity into our housing supply. Joining us today is Sam Shelby, Principal Planner with the City of Alexandria's Department of Planning and Zoning, and Max Pastore, Associate Principal at Code Studio. We'll kick off today's discussion with Sam Shelby. This year actually marks his 11th year with the city, so congratulations, Sam. He led the city's accessory dwelling unit study and wrote with the final adoption in February 2021. He also heavily was involved with the city's zoning for housing project. He's passionate about zoning reform and has crafted numerous amendments to the city's zoning ordinance during his tenure. He's also joining us from vacation, so thank you, Sam, for being here. I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks for a great introduction. Yeah, as Hannah mentioned, I've been with the city 11 years, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about our ADU program today. We started our ADU study in January of 2020. We were lucky that a couple of the city's guiding documents mentioned ADUs, accessory dwelling units, as a way to increase housing supply. And that was really, really helpful because these documents, like the housing master plan in 2013, was one of them. And when we faced opposition from residents, or we had questions from people of why we were studying an ADU policy, we could refer back to these documents and say, oh, these are city council endorsed plans that have been in the works for a long time. And it's just instrumental in justifying our efforts and explaining to residents that this is something that your elected officials have endorsed. And as I mentioned, outreach, that was when we started. 2020 is when we started putting everything on the internet. And then we were planning to have some community meetings, kind of the traditional planning community meetings. And then COVID happened right during our outreach plan. So we had to pivot very quickly, and we ended up doing a lot of learning how to use Zoom and learning how to host virtual meetings kind of on the fly. But in some ways that really served us well. We reached a lot more people than we would have ordinarily by having these virtual meetings. I think, I'm hoping that everybody had a kind of a similar and positive experience with the virtual meetings, and kind of like are here today too. So we held a bunch of virtual meetings. The Director of Housing, Helen McIlvain, kind of liked our down home videos because they're all very they're not very professional, but they're charming, I guess is kind of the word that Helen used. And we were assisted with the Urban Institute. Actually, they were selected with a competitive RFP to help us with the with research and drafting the ADU policy, and they were along for the ride for the whole thing. So we had a number of community meetings. We did online Q&A and comments. And ultimately, City Council approved our policy in January 21. So we were able to do it in a very relatively quick, short period of time. And again, I think some of the things that made that successful is how many people we reached. So we could go to Council and Planning Commission when we brought the final policy forward, and we could say we reached a really robust and broad audience. So as I said, in 2021 is when January 21 was when the policy was passed, and our policy allows ADUs by right without any. You don't need special approval. That you don't have to go to a hearing or the Board of Zoning Appeals or anything like that. It's a by right permit, and ours is a little bit unique, um, in that you are allowed ADUs are allowed also for if you're a townhouse owner that you can. Many other jurisdictions just allow them in their single unit neighborhoods, their single family neighborhoods, but ours are allowed in duplexes and semi-detached and townhouses as well. Um, and another one of the things that we kept getting asked is, how are we gonna generate ADUs? How are we gonna get the people to build them? And one tiny carrot we could offer is that the city of Alexandria, I'm not gonna try not to get too technical with the zoning details, but the city of Alexandria regulates all the lots, all the sizes of buildings in the city by floor area ratio. And it basically just tells you how big a box, a house can be, how big the house can be, and all the structures on the lot. And one of the ways that we encourage people to build them is that we say a portion or all of the ADU doesn't have to count toward your maximum structure size on your lot. And so that gives people on like small lots that have constrained floor area, they can still build an ADU even if their lot's maxed out. And it also just, if somebody would like to build an ADU but also have some other addition to their house, then that allows them to do it without it counting toward the floor area maximum or the whole thing toward the floor area maximum. Um, Detached ADUs are also exempt from our standard setback requirements. And this is really so detached ADUs don't end up in the center of a yard, that they can be tucked into corners of lots and not create these strange. One of these things that we heard from the community was, that if you have a setback of 5 feet for an ADU, for example, it really creates an odd space. It's really only a good space to store yard debris or trash, and those things bring pests and that kind of thing. So it really is better to have it as really as close to the side yard as like to the property lines as possible. Um, when we came forward in 21 to city council, we said just allow ADUs with these top three things. We The Urban Institute and staff research, really said like, okay, we don't need to regulate short-term rentals, and we shouldn't have concerns about if the owner is on site or not, because these really aren't land use regulations. These are short-term rentals are becoming kind of a little bit more land use related, but whether or not an owner lives in the main house is really not a land use consideration. It's more about property maintenance and nuisance. And we have other parts of our city code that cover if a landlord is an absentee landlord or is not taking good care of the property or something like that. However, we the city council felt otherwise, and so it's odd in Alexandria, it's quirky. Any other property in the city can be used as a short-term rental with no restrictions, but ADUs can only be used for 120 days a year. Um, and that is to try to encourage people to do long-term leases for their ADUs, which is really what we really would hope ADUs would be used for. Um, so we were, I'm going to make a judgment on that, but so that got added on at the last minute at council, and so did this final point, that the owner has to live in the main house and use it as their primary residence only at the time of ADU permit approval, which is a little bit of a compromise. A lot of other jurisdictions, including Arlington County, require that the owner either live in the, I think the owner has to live on site and can't um, can't be off site. So this is helped. What they were trying to do is deter property speculation, especially from like private equity firms that would buy property in Alexandria and then rent um, both the ADU and the main house. Um, but it's just any barriers between building an ADU and uh to getting to building an ADU are that aren't absolutely necessary really restrict the can restrict the success of your program. And this last one actually has limited our the ADU production slightly, because what we have in Alexandria a lot is tear down and rebuilds. where a developer comes in and buys a home in a neighborhood and then tears down the existing house and rebuilds a new one. And this provision really prevents them from building an ADU because they don't live on site and they don't reside at the property. We've tried to be a little bit clever about working around that because it just makes a lot more sense to have if the site's getting disturbed to just build everything at once and get an ADU. I mean, the primary purpose of the ADU policy is to have ADUs be built. So that's one thing we're working on. We will probably be revisiting the ADU policy at some point. We were a little bit busy last year with zoning for housing, so as the ADU ordinance is as much as a living document as it really can be, that it should evolve as we learn more through experience of how the policies how it's been adopted and or how it's been implemented. So since adoption in 2021, we've had 63 ADUs built, and we're very pleased with that number. I'm particularly proud of myself because we spent a lot of time trying to generate scientific estimates, but it really had to just end up being like a kind of what you because the city council and residents kept asking us, how many do you think are going to be built? And so this number is actually almost exactly what we predicted would be built every year. And so the breakdown of that a little bit is that there's 48 of them that are detached, and there are 15 that are within the main house. So, either in a basement or just in another part of the main dwelling. Um, After we approve an ADU permit, we notify the civic association, and we also have our zoning inspectors post a sign at the site to notify people that an ADU is being built there. And the reason for that is primarily to help us with enforcement of those rules that council added at the last minute at the hearing in 21, because those rules are really hard to enforce unless you have somebody that's really looking at the property almost every single day. Um, the secondary reason is that one of the worst things as a neighbor is to suddenly have a structure where you weren't expecting it to be with no notification at all. Like, and sometimes neighbors aren't super friendly with one another, and so it's better to know that it's coming rather than realize it after the shovels are in the ground and the construction has started. So the notification process is information only. It doesn't have any, there's no, a neighbor can't say something and stop the ADU process, but it's just really an informational thing that we do. And we also maintain a list on our website that shows the location of these ADUs and the type of ADU it is, whether or not it's an internal ADU or a detached ADU. This map is a little bit we provided an update to council, I believe, last year on where ADUs were, and I created this in software that I'm not that great at, so the colors of the dots are different, but that doesn't mean anything. They're just it makes it prettier and more colorful. But these are the locations of the ADUs throughout the city, and for the most part, this is also just happenstance, but they happen to be around the city's sort of either really walkable areas like Del Rey, where you can see the main cluster of them, or along transit routes. So they've naturally appeared in places that are places that are people can walk to things or have easy access to um, multiple bus lines and that kind of thing. And that brings me to one thing that I forgot to mention with our policies, that we didn't require off-street parking for our ADUs. And so it's nice to see the policy be implemented in neighborhoods where the not so car dependent neighborhoods. That is all I have. I saw a lot of great questions, so I wanted to leave plenty of time for that. But thank you for looking forward to discussing some more.
Thank you, Sam. That was amazing. Really great, insightful information. Our next speaker is Max Pastore, Associate Principal at Code Studio. Max brings extensive experience in zoning rewrite and urban design projects across different scales, collaborating with both private and public sector clients. An interesting fact about Max, though, he personally designed, permitted, and managed the construction of his own accessory dwelling unit in his DC backyard. So this hands-on experience continues to drive his commitment to making zoning more accessible and intuitive. Max, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And thanks, Hannah, for the wonderful introduction. You got that right. In fact, I would say that this ADU case study in my backyard sort of spurred a professional change for me. But before I built it, or when I was building it, I was just an urban designer doing a lot of planning and urban design work at a firm in Alexandria, actually. And then sort of after this, it was really kind of got me excited and passionate about the details of zoning itself. And so that's sort of what led me in the direction of joining the Code Studio team. And so we are a firm that does zoning updates and rewrites of all sorts across the country. So I'm an associate principal with Code Studio, and I'm gonna walk you through sort of the project that I did in my backyard for my dad. So let's see. Oops, there we go. So hello, again, my name is Max, zoning specialist at Code Studio. I am a DC homeowner and I built my own backyard ADU. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. It seems like Sam had a chance to sort of introduce you to, as well as Hannah, to what an ADU is, and I'm sure it's pretty straightforward. So I'll try to be quick about it. It's generally just, of course, a secondary living unit, mostly really on a single family designated site. Of course, that sort of changes how you interpret that across jurisdictions across the country. But generally, it requires you have to have a single family home there already before generally you can build an ADU. And that's exactly what I did. I have a house that is a semi-detached townhome, I guess, in DC. And sort of in terms of the placement and locations, I did a detached ADU. I could have done one in my basement or somewhere else in my existing townhouse, but chose to put it in the backyard instead. So again, could have done within the same building in a converted basement or something, or in a garage if I had had one, but I chose to do the backyard detached option. So why did I choose to build an ADU at all? So ultimately, I think I was really sort of inspired by three things here. The first was I have a retired dad who lives in the DC area and certainly wanted to have him closer by as he gets older and as he needs more help with things. I also wanted to build more equity in my home. There's a lot of good evidence, and was the case when I built my ADU back in 2019, that building an ADU does help build value in your home. It will, some folks will say otherwise, but it does. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that building an ADU will add value to your home. And just, as a planner, I was inspired, feeling like, maybe this would be the opportunity for me to actually do something on the ground for combating the ongoing housing crisis in DC. So that was sort of like the three-part piece of that. I was also of course, very inspired by my profession. DC's by right ADU zoning, sort of speaking to what Sam said about Alexandria, that was certainly a huge factor. If that was not a by right option, meaning I could submit a permit at the counter in DC and without going to a public hearing or any sort of conditional review board, I could get this ADU approved and built without going to the public. So that was definitely something that if that was not the case, I probably would not have been as eager to try the ADU process. So, and here's just a list of a collection of articles at the time that were very much inspiring me, right? So tiny homes, ADUs, tiny houses, things that the Coalition for Smarter Growth in our region had been promoting, particularly ADUs. Those are all things that were getting me very excited and passionate about doing an ADU. So while I was convinced, did that mean that my family was convinced? Luckily, yes, it was not a very hard sell. So my dad, who is still the tenant, was very much on board. And my husband was also very, very excited about the idea. So that led me to make some trips at the time to what was called DCRA, now the DC Department of Buildings, in 2018. It took a little while just to sort of understand what I could and couldn't do. And ultimately, I decided to build a very, very small accessory dwelling unit, 280 square feet, in fact. That is basically the smallest at the time ADU that I was allowed to build based on DC code. And I really couldn't go too much bigger based on sort of the ratio that the city has in place to sort of regulate the ADU size based on your primary home. So I have a pretty small house as it is, so I couldn't go very big. And I also didn't want to go very big. So 280 square feet was sort of like the sweet spot. So here's a quick site plan of that. Generally, you can see what's highlighted in red is that accessory dwelling unit. It's on the ground. I'll show some pictures in the next slides of like the construction of that and how that looks today. This bigger box, or this whiter box with a 26 on top, is my existing home. You can see it sits right on the property line. There's another house that we share a party wall with. So yeah, happy to discuss any of the details if folks want to talk about that during the Q&A. Made some more visits to DOB. And ultimately, after 5 months of reviews, which honestly not an ideal situation for an ADU process, 3 permit revisions, adding fire sprinklers, which I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, but I don't believe that is a requirement in Virginia. It is in DC and Maryland, which is kind of unfortunate, adds a lot of cost. I had to provide a soil erosion plan, which also kind of unfortunate. I had to go through I had to get other permits from other agencies like DC Water. And luckily, I don't think DC or DDOT, but it was not as straightforward as it could have been. But ultimately, I did get my permit, which I was thrilled about in May of 2019. And we immediately started construction. So started with a site like this. Our house really didn't have much in the backyard at all. You can see this is the semi-detached situation that we were in. So right up against our neighbor, we had a blank canvas. Luckily, it was flat. And then sort of right behind that, there's a hill that drops down very steep. So we were all good to go from a soil erosion perspective. And then we started building. You'll see with all the trenching and the foundations that were built that our contractor definitely overdid it when it came to building our foundation in our house. I like to joke that the ADU will probably withstand a natural disaster more than the main house will, between fire sprinklers, the way that it was built, with the foundation, the amount of insulation that's got in there, like noise, all of it is pretty hardy. And here's sort of as the process was going, took basically, it was a pretty quick process. We used a prefab product actually. So we were able to work with a company out of Denver. So I was sort of able to collaborate, as Hannah mentioned, sort of from the design perspective with them, sort of get a pre-approved set, or not a pre-approved set, but basically a building that could be flat packed to me from the Colorado area. And ultimately was finished with my contractor, basically did all the interior finishes with materials that were locally sourced. So you can sort of see that come together. We're getting pathways built to access the unit from the side yard. You start to see the interior, right? So it's a pretty small space, but luckily, we've got some good windows in here that really add to make the space look a lot bigger than it really is. Makes 280 feel much more breezy. Here's it after all of the drywall was added and the kitchen is getting built in the front piece of the building. Lots of light again, and really get some nice lighting, sort of especially during the sunsets, just like conveniently our building was aligned the right way, I guess. And here is the complete interior right before my dad had moved in, conveniently, like the Christmas before COVID started. So that could not have been better. We, as you can see, very, very much like went in the direction of going all white, light colors, things that would not close in the space much at all. We took advantage of a Murphy bed that's also a couch when it's not being used as a bed, as you can sort of see in the corner here. And this is what the exterior completed looked like. So you'll see it's a little different than the image that I shared in my cover slide. This is before the vegetation started to grow in and before we added, deck furniture and things like that. But ultimately, it came out quite well. We're extremely happy with the product. And yeah, my dad has been living in this unit since he moved in. So I guess almost, maybe 4 years now, maybe 4 or 5 years, which is pretty wild. Hopefully I'm doing my math right. Correct me if I'm wrong. And yeah, I wouldn't have honestly changed anything about it. Like we've grown into it really well. He has his own space. We have our own space, but in a pinch, we have access to each other. Works out great. So just wanted to share some initial takeaways that I had based on the project. Some of this stuff is probably going to be very much in alignment with think what Hannah was sort of mentioning about her own experience living in an accessory dwelling unit, as well as Sam's experience trying to implement zoning legislation in Alexandria. But in my based on my experience, ADUs, if you want to see them get built, particularly by folks who like in a market where there's a lot of flipping happening, best works in a competitive market. ADUs are not going to be super viable or appealing to folks who, unless it's a multi-generational situation, unless they can really add a lot of value to their property. So as Sam mentioned, or of course the DC region, Alexandria, DC, Arlington, great markets for ADUs. They are also very well suited for a range of folks, young adults. That was pretty much the experience of Hannah from what she described, sort of like going to school, working retail. It was like perfect situation for that. Singles, retirees, that very much fits my dad's demographic. And multi-generational living, right? That is also a situation that we have where my husband and I live in the main unit, my dad's in the back. So at the time, so this was, I guess, like in 2018, 2019, there wasn't a lot of ADU experience in the DC region that we had noticed. I was kind of surprised at the time, even though DC had had its legislation on the books since like 2016 or so. Even after 3 years of having it in place, many of the permit reviewers who I had gone to had never reviewed an ADU application before. And based on the fact that it was a detached building and not attached as an addition to my existing house, it had to go through as a new construction project or new construction permit type, which was effectively the same type of application that I would have had to do if I were building a single family home from scratch. So not an ideal situation, certainly tricky for folks who are not in my situation, who like a homeowner who is not in the built environment industry, who didn't go to school for architecture, who is not a planner. Very, very big barrier to entry. And a lot of local contractors aren't really interested in doing ADUs, I've noticed, at least at that time. Still seems to be the case these days. Many have not built them. They're very small projects. They don't make a lot of money on them. They're small spaces, so that's a pain in the butt for them to get things into a backyard in a small lot. So you really have to like convince folks, in particular, like getting, for example, like fire sprinklers in my ADU, like had to go through like 3 different vendors before somebody agreed to even do the project because it's so small, nobody wants to tackle it. So just a lot of that stuff really starts to add up over time. And I think Sam was sort of getting to a lot of those barriers in his presentation as well. So some other ongoing hurdles that kind of speak to the future, about just ADUs going forward is really for financing in particular. If you're not a developer, you're not doing a flip or something like that, it's really cost prohibitive. In all transparency, I think we probably, for such a small unit like that, and with me doing, all of the project management, submitting, permits and all that, still cost us around like, probably 130 grand in 2019 to build this thing. And we did that through we took out a hodgepodge of different loans. We were such fresh homeowners that we couldn't do an equity, like a homeowner equity line of credit. So it was very, very tough to do. A lot of folks a lot of vendors were like very skeptical of ADUs. So it's not like these things just happen overnight because like, wow, I can just build an ADU. It's still very tough to do. The permitting process, again, was quite complicated and unpredictable. And luckily for me, I knew how to navigate that. Most homeowners don't. And in terms of marketing, I think this really goes to what Hannah had mentioned initially, where the idea of like, what is an ADU? Like, is in the DC region, there's this idea of affordable dwelling units. What's that versus an ADU? It's just tough to understand. So homeowners are like, are these tiny homes? Are these affordable dwelling units? Are these like subsidized? Like, what are these things? I can build them. Why can I build them? Why can I build them in basements versus in back? Like, why do they take up all these different types of forms? Why can't I do a tiny home that's connected like an RV might? Can I Airbnb it? Stuff that Sam brought up. So a lot of that stuff gets tricky and really spooks homeowners from doing this type of thing. So in terms of Virginia jurisdictions in particular, I know my My ADU is built in DC, so not necessarily applicable. But to Sam's point, do absolutely allow these things by right. It's not, a one size fits all solution when it comes to affordable housing, but my God, it is really, really hard to get these things approved and very expensive if you have to consider a conditional use permit or anything like that. A homeowner doesn't even know how to do that in most cases, and it can get quite expensive, and it can add around 2 to 6 months of time onto the application process. It's just, yeah, it'll certainly spook anybody who might be interested in doing it if it's not a by right process. Again, simplify the permitting, makes that a lot easier too. If you have a specific ADU permit application process, even better. I think sort of the considerations too that I thought were helpful, and it seems like it's sort of building on what Sam had mentioned about sort of developer built ADUs. If you're to allow for developers, if they were to scrape a site clean and build a home or build something to replace that site or that existing home, having ADUs as an option for them to build, even though they're not living on the site, is really beneficial, not only because they're more likely to build it because they understand the process and they've got a bigger project going on. So what's an extra unit? That's really not much for them to deal with. The other thing too with that is that ultimately they, I just forgot my point, but generally I was going to say having the flipper stuff, I remember now, it sort of de-incentivizes big mansions, which is a really, really important piece. So if a developer only has the option to do a single family home on a site that's already very, very high value, they're going to scrap it clean and they're going to max out that building envelope as big as possible. And you're never going to get a workforce house out of that. You're only going to get a multi-million-dollar product. And in this case, they might still try to do that. They might still do a big unit, but at least now you've got an ADU that could be used as more entry-level housing that starts to diversify the neighborhood. So something to consider there. Pre-approved designs, even better. This is something that, for example, a lot of jurisdictions in the West Coast have done. City of Los Angeles is a great example of this. And some other, it's my last slide here, and then we can open it up for Q&A, but some things to consider additionally from a legislative perspective. Something that I think was brought up is sort of the ongoing discussion of Virginia trying to maybe do a statewide legalization approach to ADUs. That is something that California did, and I will say, as a consultant who works in 3 Southern California jurisdictions rebuilding their codes from scratch, Palm Springs, California, Pomona, California, and the city of Los Angeles, this is absolutely the right approach. It might sound scary and can be spooky, but ultimately by approving ADUs, sort of making it so that yes, ADUs have to be allowed on single family properties, across the state under certain circumstances, basically makes the conversation so much easier. And maybe Sam can speak to this from his own experience from a local jurisdiction, but it makes it so much easier to not have to pick the fight with the public, and say like, well, do we want to have them or do we not want to have them? Instead, it's like, okay, we're going to have them. Let's focus on what they're going to look like. We're going to go. What's the form of these things? More of the details, the meat of the conversation, the stuff that's more important in my perspective. And ultimately, it results in more equitable applications. So you might get a jurisdiction, that's very, very well off that might bar ADUs because they're doing it case by case by case, versus more of a middle income or lower income jurisdiction that introduces them, and you start to get a lot of income inequality where like ADUs are getting built only in affordable jurisdictions and not in expensive jurisdictions, and it's not helping folks with commutes and anything like that. So it doesn't mean that you have to do it all by right all at once. California did that for ADUs, but they did some different stuff for lot splits based on census tracts, for example. So if you're in an urbanized census tract, anything that's zoned, for example, for single family says, okay, you have to allow for an accessory dwelling unit by right. And then you jurisdiction figure out what that's going to look like. The other alternative here would be a project selfishly that Code Studios worked on, which is Charlottesville, is more local to Virginia, ultimately, what we decided to do with the city there was just sort of move away from ADUs altogether and say, look, it's not, we don't really care. It's a second unit at this point, right? It's just stop trying to make it a unique thing. It's just an additional unit treated like one. And so basically in Charlottesville now, there is no more 1 unit per lot situation anywhere in the city. It's at least 2 and has gone up in some places based on sort of a market analysis and more equitable applications of density to sort of calibrate for density bonuses and stuff like that. So that sounds like a lot of jargon, but I'm happy to talk about it or not during the Q&A. But those were some things I thought were kind of helpful. And I think that's ultimately all I have.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Max and Sam and Hannah, for that amazing perspective on this topic that I think we do have a lot of continued, obviously, interest and confusion about. So I'm going to go ahead and try to read some of the questions people put in the chat. Continue to put your questions in the chat, and we're going to answer them live here right now. We also received some of your questions that you asked when you registered for the session. We appreciated that and hopefully use those to inform the presentation here today. So we might have addressed some of that. So again, thank you. We're going to start local, just some questions for Sam, and talking a little bit about the permit and what that permit requires. It's by right, but there is a permit that's required in Alexandria. And what does that really require or mean?
Right. So it is, yeah, it's a little bit confusing. It's by right, but we still at the the zoning ordinance is still trying to control or still controls how big and how close your structures are to your neighbors. So we still need to see a plat that shows a survey of your land, showing like kind of like what Max was showing earlier in one of his presentation, showing where you're going to put it, and then the other stuff that Max was talking about too, the building code, to make sure it doesn't fall down or catch fire too easily, or the structural concerns. That's the things that the building code requires. So that's there. It's still the plans needed for ADUs are still pretty detailed. I don't know. I'm not the building code expert, unfortunately, but I don't think it's quite as awful or lengthy as Max's experience in DC. But it is, depending on the size of the project, it can be pretty involved, the permitting process.
Great, thank you. And just really a follow-up, does Alexandria have any pre-approved plans for ADUs like Max mentioned on the West Coast in California and Oakland?
Not, I want to say the answer is no. I would like to say not yet, but that's something we could look at in a phase 2. The city does have a something for, if you want to, it's a quite a different product, obviously, but if you want to build a deck at your home, then we do have these standard deck details that you can submit to us, and it's a lot easier to get a permit for a deck. And hopefully, someday there could be a similar process for ADU permits.
Great, thank you. So this could be a question for both of you. You can both answer. Do you have any way of knowing how these ADUs are being used? Are they being used for rental, just for family, the short term? Is there any tracking mechanism that either one of you have seen to see how people use these units?
We don't require, the city doesn't require people to disclose why or how they're using their ADUs when they get their ADU permit applications. We have I informally reached out to several ADU applicants before this meeting to sort of just get a feel for what people are using them for. In general, and again, this isn't technical data or anything like that, but in general, people are just using them for extra space. Which sounds disappointing at first, because we'd really like to see them used for rental, that people are actually living in them, and that these ADUs are being used by people who maybe couldn't otherwise afford the neighborhood that they're built in. But to us, it's as long as the housing unit, the ADU unit, gets built, it's like Max said, they have to follow traditional construction rules and structural rules, so they will last for a long time, and that house may not be under the same ownership or won't be under the same ownership for the whole duration of that building. So at some point, it would be used for, you know, a rental in the way that we really intended for them to be used. But we do have, some are used as short-term rentals. Some people live in the ADU and then rent out their main home, which is another kind of clever way of doing it. And some, you know, the most common use of them informally, again, is just extra space for, you know, out of town guests or, you know, that kind of thing.
Great. And how about you, Max? Have you seen any tracking mechanism nationally or any of the other jurisdictions you've worked in?
I haven't looked at any like in myself, but I'm pretty sure quite a few of the jurisdictions in California do, mostly because of sort of auditing purposes. So because of state law in California, it's super. I mean, I talked about the approach a little bit, but like ultimately, they've gotten to the point where if your zoning rules in a local jurisdiction, basically like anything like even setbacks, coverage, sort of block the ability for someone to build an accessory dwelling unit on their property, your zoning goes out the door. And you have to make it work. So you basically have to have that ADU fit because their housing crisis is so bad. So they need this data to be able to make sure that they're calibrating the stuff going forward correctly. So I would not be, I'm sure City of Los Angeles does. I believe City of Pomona that we work with as well does as well. But I will say something that sort of to that point about the use of ADUs that is quite interesting is sort of like it does get really tricky to enforce the use of ADUs. You know, most jurisdictions deal with them. You know, any sort of like zoning complaint that happens is typically not a proactive one. It's typically like, it's not like, you know, zoning, you know, code inspectors are driving through the streets and like, oh, what's going on in that building, right? It's more like neighbor complaints. So it's typically the result of like neighborhood conflict. So it gets a little dicey, but ultimately, I think someone had asked a question about, you know, did I get neighbors complaining about my ADU? And it could be based on the neighborhood that I live in, but it was quite the opposite. It was like people were totally thrilled. They were like, "Whoa, what is that? Like, can I go take a look at it? This is so cool." No complaints whatsoever.
Great, thank you. Sam, do you have any indication in Alexandria if there were private equity groups that accounted for any of the ADUs that had been approved? I think that would have meant that they had to purchase the property, I think, after they were permitted, but I don't know if you track that either.
It's really hard to track that kind of, you know, sales data. Again, sort of a gut reaction answer to that is there is no indication that this is happening, at least at our stage. You know, most of the applicants that we get are the owners of the property, or they're you know, we have 4 or 5 or 6 or, you know, a handful of local developers that do projects frequently in Alexandria, and they tend to be the you know, the firms that are hired by homeowners to build the ADUs.
Got it. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit if the city had any parking considerations when reviewing the proposed policy and how you've handled that in Alexandria? And then Max, you might have some other thoughts about how other jurisdictions have handled that.
Yeah, so we looked at Arlington County because they did their ADU policy before we did, and they have a, I'm gonna just give a quick summary. This isn't exactly accurate, but they have they require parking for the ADU, and they, if it's like there's something, they do some sort of survey to see what the demand on street parking is in the neighborhood. And that is partially determines whether or not the ADU would require parking. We as a city are moving away from requiring as much parking as we have historically. And one of the main reasons we didn't require it at all for ADUs is that there were a lot of concerns about lot coverage and impervious surfaces. And, you know, if you require an ADU and you require parking for the ADU, it's starting to change how the lot reads. If there's too much parking on a lot, then it just is not super pleasing aesthetically, but it's also just like kind of an environmental challenge, or it creates just more opportunity for stormwater runoff. So you can't have it all. You either be, but in one of the, and that's kind of what we told people when we came to this conclusion. We were like, okay, this is, that was the balancing act, is that we have to consider lot coverage, and requiring more off-street parking is less important than maintaining like having less impervious surfaces.
Great, thank you. How about you, Max? Have you seen parking be a chief consideration when these ordinances are getting passed?
I would say, parking is always, like, no matter the jurisdiction, parking is always considered. People are very precious about their parking. But we typically don't recommend requiring parking with ADUs, pretty much for the same reasons that Sam outlined. And in fact, it's statewide as part of the ADU legislation in California, jurisdictions are not allowed to require it. So I think with some exceptions, there's certain instances where if the city basically, if they do require it, they have to sort of prove it. So it actually puts the onus on the city, not the owner, to prove that parking is needed, which I think is fair. Because a homeowner is not going to know how to do have to hire somebody to do a traffic signal. That's ridiculous. So yeah, I would say that that's certainly pretty consistent across the board. And I did not have to provide parking for mine, for reference.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, what happens, because I think this is really useful for our kind of outer jurisdictions, and I don't know if you have any information about this, either one of you, but what happens when there's a conflict between the city or county ordinance and homeowners associations or homeowner association covenants? Do they override the homeowner association covenants that wouldn't allow for ADUs, or have you experienced that in Alexandria or other jurisdictions?
We don't have to get involved, because those covenants are private agreements that are agreed to for a condo association or a homeowners association. So the city, if the city allows it, and your homeowners association doesn't, then we can give you approval for it, but then you're going to be in trouble probably legally with your homeowners association. So it doesn't override their rules. You can still get approval from us, and we can't issue any violations for you violating your homeowners association covenants. But like, as I said, you can, depending on, a lot of these documents are, in some of our neighborhoods, there are restrictive covenants. Some are way uglier than others, but there are ones that are from the 40s that have limitations that either, you have to do a title search. I would really recommend you do a title search before you, go down the ADU permitting process, because you don't want to build something and then have a neighbor say, oh, in 1947, the subdivision committee said that, you can only have a single unit house on your lot. And so that's a little bit more information there. But so there is some evidence in Alexandria of there being restrictive language in these old deeds that may or may not still be applicable.
Thank you. How about Max, you have anything else to add there?
I would just say that's pretty consistent across the board in the US. I think it's a little, like, the legal waters are a little unclear in California with that stuff, because I think generally depends on interpretation. Like, a lot of jurisdictions would say that the HOA has no authority to regulate that stuff, but some others, it depends on who is suing whom, basically.
Yeah, okay. And Max, you touched on this a little bit about how ADUs impact land value. So you said that there's data to show that it does increase land value. And just the interesting opposing concern is if it would make homeownership less attainable on a larger scale. But again, I think we're not seeing every homeowner build an ADU unit. I remember seeing some interesting data, Max, that you might have from California, where maybe it's 1 or 2 per block in California, and the fears of everyone building an ADU unit has just not been realized, because it takes a special individual or homeowner who wants to do that. So I don't know if you have anything else to add about that.
I will say there are some folks that I would say that's absolutely spot on. The interesting thing though that you'll now see, which I think, you know, some folks probably wouldn't like, but others, I would say it's not bad at all, is if you look at like Redfin listings for California single family homes these days, they will almost always tell you that you are able to build like great yard, you could fit an ADU and a junior ADU, you know. So I mean, they're very much good at advertising, you know, for future homeowners, because it's as a way to build value and build, you know, to have an income investment, right? So that they can actually choose to buy something and then help subsidize their mortgage. So but yeah, I would say ultimately you're not going to get in a situation, at least within the next foreseeable future, where it's going to make it more unattainable to buy.
Great, thank you. So a couple questions about like if Alexandria limits the number of bedrooms or imposes a maximum size of an ADU, and then really kind of a follow-up question about occupancy limitations and how that works as well.
So there is a maximum size, like the ADU has to be calculated within the basically the amount of allowable square footage on the lot, but you are allowed a little bit of an incentive, like it's 350 square feet that can be excluded of the ADU itself. But basically the rules are structured so the ADU has to be proportional to the size of the main house. Max was kind of mentioning that in his presentation, and one of the things that we did is to grant an always allowed size of an ADU. So if you have a small main house, that you can still build a reasonably sized ADU, and you don't have to get as clever as Max did with the footprint and everything like that. That you can still build a reasonable sized unit. So there are no limits on the number or minimums of the number of bedrooms. We do require, you know, because a lot of people came to us and said, I want to build an ADU, but I don't really want to incur the expense of putting in the kitchen and the bathroom. And we said, no, I mean, unfortunately, no. If you're not building a living unit, then you can't have the things that come along with the ADU permit process. So we do mandate that there's a bathroom and that is separately, you know, that it has an ability to be heated or cooled, and that it has a kitchen. And we do limit, it is in the it's in the zoning ordinance, and again, it doesn't really belong there, but it is, we do limit the number of occupants in an ADU to 3 people.
Great, okay, thank you. And is that common to what you see, Max, and the occupancy and bedroom space?
Yeah, outside of like California, which, you know, really quite feels like the Wild West relative to the rest of the country. That's pretty typical. I think DC was, for me, I couldn't exceed 50% of my total square footage within the house. So, and then I still couldn't exceed the total coverage allowed on my site. So that was the two numbers that I had to fit between, and that 280 was like the only number that I could hit. So I had a minimum requirement. It had to be at least 280 square feet in total size. And then I couldn't go above half of the size of my house. So it was like, give or take. And then I also couldn't exceed 45% lot coverage. So it was like, there was like probably like a room for like 50 square feet here or there that I had to play with. And that's exactly what I did.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about real estate taxes and how the ADU impacts the total tax valuations, or what you've seen there, I guess, in Alexandria?
So for us, I'm hoping Max has a better answer than this. When we reached out to our real estate assessments department to ask them about this, it's a reasonable answer. They were saying that, you know, we can't really judge how these are going to impact value until they start selling, until the house where the ADU was built is sold, because that's apparently part of how they value housing, is to look at comparable sales. So it's not until they have these houses, or, you know, the house with the ADU built and sold, that they'll have that data. In general, though, you know, adding square footage and livable square footage to your lot adds value to your, you know, and so the city's going to want to assess that so they can get the taxes on it. But I think they are having a little bit of trouble putting a scientific value on it until or not scientific value, but you know, having a methodology for evaluating them until they start selling.
I would say that's also sort of consistent with DC. There was no requirement for me to like go and get my house reassessed after the fact. So until the city comes through and does their, you know, their regular property assessments, effectively it's treated the same as it was. So like my property taxes on an annual basis are not changed because of the EDU.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Just a couple more questions. We are going to send out the presentations. We'll send out the resources that we've included in the chat, and then a recording of this video for everybody that registered, because I'm seeing some of those questions as well. And we'll try to get you more information. I'd go ahead and refer to the statewide. We had a bill go before the General Assembly about mandating ADU units, ordinances in all jurisdictions. That did not pass, and it's now at the Housing Commission, a work group of the Housing Commission, so you can see their May 20th meeting and what they're saying. Frankly, they had presentations from local governments that might have not been the most pro ADU audience. We need to have Max and Sam go down and show them how it's actually working in different jurisdictions, so stay tuned on that. But just like one final question for you all, what's the differences in the definition when an ADU is within the existing home structure? Do you see any differences in the ordinances that you, either in Alexandria, that you're writing for other jurisdictions? Is there any
we do have we basically say, again, to try to keep the ADU as like a accessory, that it's not its own standalone full-size unit. An internal unit has to be a third of the main size of the house. And it is a little bit less meaningful now because of our zoning for housing changes, where you can have multiple units in the previously only single family zones. I'm not sure that's something that we exactly got right, but it was just to show that people that the impacts from ADUs would not be super great, that they're going to be smaller units than the main house.
I would say a lot of jurisdictions, it's kind of all over the place in terms of if they change the definition for that sort of thing.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much. We're going to also be sending out a matrix outlining the differences in the ADU ordinances from Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax County. Currently, Loudoun and Prince William do not have ADU ordinances, but I know it's something they're looking at. So we hope this session provided some additional information and context. And I can't thank our presenters again enough. So Max Pastor and Sam Shelby and Hannah Matuda for welcoming us with your comments about the impact an ADU has had on your life as well. So thank you all. Great to see you. See you next time. Have a great day.